close your eyes and let your imagination take you back to an autumn night in the year 1501. You are walking through the endless corridors of the Vatican, where the glow of hundreds of flickering candles casts trembling light upon the old stone walls. Incense smoke drifts through the air, yet mingled with that sacred fragrance is something entirely different. The smell of strong wine, the scent of sweat, the warmth of human flesh. Together, they form a mixture that turns what is supposed to be the holiest place of God into something strange, even unsettling. You pause. Your ears catch a sound, the rustle of silk, the sharp echo of shoes on stone floors, intertwined with soft, suggestive laughter. These are not the voices of sacred hymns, not whispered prayers, but the sounds of a worldly feast, a banquet drowning in desire. And the most terrifying part is that all of this is unfolding at the very heart of the Catholic Church. Tonight, there will be no sermons of salvation, no confessions spoken aloud. Instead, there is a scandalous performance that history would later remember with a chilling name, the Banquet of Chestnuts. On the marble floor, candlelight reveals faces flushed red from wine and from lust. Powerful cardinals, Roman nobles, even foreign envoys sit at the same tables, beside women brought in to entertain them. They raise their cups of wine, laugh loudly, and prepare to take part in games so debauched that centuries later, people would still shudder to hear them retold. And the Pope himself, the man regarded as God's representative on earth, the one who should embody virtue and purity, sits at the very center. He watches, he smiles, he delights in the spectacle, like a worldly prince savoring his pleasures. Beside him are his own children, living pawns in the Borgia family's ruthless game of power. That moment feels like a collapse beyond redemption. And you cannot help but wonder, how could the Vatican, once the symbol of faith, sacrifice, and devotion, transform into a palace of vice? How could the throne of St. Peter, the sacred heart of all Europe, fall into the hands of a man like this? The answer lies in the life and career of Rodrigo Borgia, the man history remembers as Pope Alexander VI. Born in Spain, he was not distinguished for his devotion to God, but for his burning thirst for power. From an early age, he learned to use every advantage at his disposal: wealth, family connections, and even the allure of the flesh. Step by step, he climbed the ladders of the church, not through prayer, but through gold and secret bargains. And when he finally sat upon the papal throne, it was as if all of Europe realized that the sacred had been traded away for money and earthly desire. But the most frightening truth was not just the corruption of one man. It was the fact that an entire system had allowed it, even encouraged it. The story you are about to hear is not merely a biography. It is a journey through both light and shadow, a mirror of the Renaissance itself, a time when magnificent cathedrals, immortal paintings, and sacred music were created, even as, behind the curtain, games of power, the selling of souls, and nights of debauchery unfolded side by side. Tonight, let your mind drift slowly with this tale. Imagine yourself sitting in a darkened room, lit only by the faint glow of a candle. Listen to the story of Pope Alexander VI, remembered as the most scandalous pope in history. His journey will take us from a small village in Spain to the grand yet decaying halls of the Vatican, and at last to a legacy that even to this day the world still debates. This is a story of absolute power, of desire unbound, and of the terrible price a dynasty must pay when a man, believed to hold the keys to heaven, falls into the depths of earthly darkness. The story begins in a small town, nestled among the dry hills of eastern Spain. On January 1st, 1431, in a local noble family in Sativa, near Valencia, a baby boy named Rodrigo Borgia was born. No one, at that moment, could have imagined that this newborn child would one day become one of the most controversial figures in the history of the Church. In his youth, Rodrigo lived within a unique setting. Spain was still marked by the long wars against the Moors, a land where religion and political power were always intertwined. From the very beginning, Rodrigo learned an important truth. In this world, faith was not always the only path upward. Power, connections, and cunning were the keys that opened the doors of destiny. A turning point came in 1455 when his uncle, Alfonso de Borja, was elected Pope Calixtus III. With a family member as head of the church, Rodrigo was quickly brought to Rome. By the age of 25, he had already been appointed a cardinal deacon, not for devotion nor for theological brilliance, but for something far more familiar in European politics of the time: family ties and patronage. Rome, in those years, was a city of two faces. By day, it was the holy destination of pilgrims, the center of art and architecture. Magnificent churches rang out with songs of praise to God. But when night fell, Rome revealed another side. Streets filled with courtesans, merchants dealing in everything, even the salvation of souls. A city at once sacred and profane, so much so that Dante himself, had he lived to see it, might have wept. Rodrigo adapted quickly. He did not merely survive in this environment, he thrived on it. He built his fortune by collecting church offices across Europe, a monastery here, a cathedral there, each one bringing in generous revenues. Rodrigo lived not as an ascetic cleric, but as a Renaissance prince. Lavish banquets, splendid palaces, countless lovers. It was said that he fathered children almost season by season, each child another piece. In the grand game of power, he was carefully setting on the board. Rodrigo's prominence did not come only from his wealth. He was a man of striking presence, tall in stature, sharp in his gaze, eloquent in his words. He understood the art of diplomacy, knowing when to compromise and when to use gold to break down resistance. To many, Rodrigo Borgia did not resemble a cleric at all, but a natural-born politician willing to do whatever it took to reach his goals. Yet that very rise to prominence also made him the target of public scrutiny. In 1460, Pope Pius II himself wrote a letter rebuking Rodrigo for his public displays of debauchery in Siena. The letter described his feasts as having shocked the entire city and court, but Rodrigo was undeterred. He understood that honor could be lost, but power must never be surrendered. With patience, with cunning, and with an endless supply of gold, Rodrigo gradually became one of the most powerful figures in Rome. He built a vast network of allies, from Italian nobles to wealthy merchants to ambitious cardinals. To him, every relationship could be turned into a bargaining chip. And then, after decades of maneuvering, the opportunity he had long awaited finally arrived. In August of 1492, Pope Innocent VIII died. The cardinals gathered in conclave, locking the doors to choose his successor. Inside that chamber filled with candle smoke, gold changed hands, and whispered promises floated like prayers. Rodrigo Borgia, with coffers overflowing and a carefully woven web of allies, stepped into the greatest game of his life. When white smoke rose to signal a new pope had been chosen, the world watched Rodrigo emerge with a new name, Pope Alexander VI, a pontiff elected not by divine inspiration, but by earthly calculation. Rome celebrated with joy, believing they had gained a strong and splendid reign. But they did not yet realize this was also the moment when true darkness began to fall over the Vatican. After the support of his uncle, Calixtus III, had first lifted him into the College of Cardinals, Rodrigo Borgia had entered the highest ranks of the Church. For a man not yet 30, it was a meteoric rise. But what stirred the city most was not the speed of his ascent. It was the way he lived and the scandals that kept all of Rome whispering his name. While many other cardinals chose a life of simplicity, Rodrigo built the image of a true Renaissance nobleman. He acquired magnificent palaces, decorated with expensive frescoes and sculptures. He hosted endless banquets, where wine flowed freely, and singers, musicians, and actors gathered to entertain the elite. No one saw in him the austerity of a man devoted to God. What they saw instead was the luxury and indulgence of a prince of pleasure. What shocked people most was Rodrigo's openly public love life. He had many mistresses, the most prominent being Vanosa Catanei, a clever and sharp-witted Roman noblewoman. With her, he fathered 4 children: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Giuffre. These children would later become political instruments in the bloody and cunning game that the Borgia family would play. At a time when priests, bishops, and even cardinals were bound by vows of celibacy, the fact that a cardinal maintained an entire household with many children was nothing short of scandalous. Rome, though long accustomed to corruption, was still stunned. Commoners gossiped in the markets. Ambassadors noted the details in reports sent back to their courts. And the reigning popes themselves were forced to speak out. In 1460, Pope Pius II sent Rodrigo a furious letter, accusing him of living in Siena in a manner that had terrified the entire city and court. Such a letter should have made any man pause. But Rodrigo did not falter. He brushed aside the rebuke, as if personal honor itself were nothing more than a coin to be traded. That moment feels like a collapse beyond redemption, and you cannot help but wonder, how could the Vatican, once the symbol of faith, sacrifice, and devotion, transform into a palace of vice? How could the throne of St. Peter, the sacred heart of all Europe, fall into the hands of a man like this? And behind the feasts, behind the noisy affairs, stood a man of ruthless calculation. Rodrigo did not spend lavishly only for his own pleasure. He used money to bribe, to buy loyalty, to expand his web of power. He gathered church offices like precious jewels, a bishopric in Spain, a monastery in France, a cathedral in Italy, each one bringing steady income, together forming an immense fortune. In the eyes of many, Rodrigo Borgia was like a giant spider. From his palace in Rome, he spun threads that stretched across Europe, slowly but with certainty, drawing power back into his web. Yet extravagance, for him, was not only a tool, it had become a habit, woven into his very being. Rodrigo loved art, but not in the sense of sacred devotion. He loved performances, music, sensual dances. He admired the beauty of women, without disguise, without shame. It was said that as he walked through the streets of Rome, Rodrigo might stop to speak openly with a woman who had caught his desire, and then bring her directly back to his residence, unfazed by the eyes of the crowd. In this setting, the image of Cardinal Borgia emerged as both admirable and fearsome. Admirable, for a wealth and influence few could rival. Fearsome, because he dared to openly disregard the very moral standards the Church sought so hard to preserve. And yet, all of this was only preparation for a greater goal, the papal throne. Rodrigo knew that, to reach it, he needed more than money. He needed reputation, overwhelming presence, and a network of allies wide enough to crush any opposition. His life of indulgence, the affairs, the banquets, the children, became the foundation stones of a grand conquest. Amid the flickering candlelight of his feasts, between music and drunken laughter, Rodrigo Borgia turned Rome into his stage. A stage where he was actor, director, and master manipulator all at once. And his audience, from commoners to kings, could not look away, whether they wished to or not. Behind that glittering facade lay a truth that could not be denied. Rodrigo's ambition no longer fit within the limits of a cardinal. It had grown far beyond, larger, bolder, and far more dangerous. In the summer of 1492, Rome was filled with anticipation. Pope Innocent VIII had just died, leaving behind a vast power vacuum. The city buzzed with rumor. Who would succeed to the throne of St. Peter? Who would hold the fate of the Church in the years to come? On those sweltering August days, 23 cardinals entered the Sistine Chapel. The doors closed firmly behind them. From that moment on, the outside world could only wait for the signal of rising smoke, the sign of a new pope. But inside those sacred walls, the truth was not merely prayer, nor revelation from God. It was a game of strategy, a game played with gold, with promises, and with betrayal. Rodrigo Borgia had long prepared for this moment. He brought not only ambition with him. He entered the conclave with heavy purses of coin and secret deals laid out in advance. One by one, he approached the cardinals with skill. To those who needed money, he offered bags of gold. To those hungry for power, he promised lucrative offices. And to the hesitant, he whispered sweet words, assuring them that supporting him today would secure their future. The scene inside the Sistine Chapel, if revealed, would have shaken the world. Beneath the ceiling that Michelangelo would one day adorn with genius, cardinals exchanged envelopes of gold, like merchants in a marketplace. Oaths sworn before God, were replaced with quiet bargains, where earthly power completely overshadowed the sacred. And then, on August 11th, 1492, white smoke rose from the chapel chimney. The news spread across Rome. Rodrigo Borgia had succeeded. He was elected Pope, taking the name Alexander VI. The people poured into the streets, shouting in torchlight. Bonfires lit up the 7 hills. Processions stretched for miles. Triumphal arches of wood and embroidered cloth decorated the avenues. Rome rejoiced, as if they had welcomed a savior. On the day of his coronation at St. Peter's Basilica, historians recorded that no pope had ever been welcomed with such enthusiasm. The people longed for a reign of strength and energy, one that would restore order to Rome after years of turmoil. Indeed, Alexander VI began his papacy with reforms that surprised many. He ordered the reorganization of the city's districts, appointed officials to enforce security, and sought to end the violence that had claimed more than 200 lives in just a few months prior. He even opened his doors to the public every Tuesday, personally hearing complaints and handling matters with efficiency. In the eyes of many, it was a promising beginning. But behind the curtain, the true nature of Rodrigo Borgia had not changed. His seat upon the papal throne was not the fruit of divine inspiration, but the result of a shameless campaign of vote buying. Even contemporary historians did not hide the truth when they wrote that Alexander VI was a pope purchased, not chosen. And yet, the paradox lay here. The people of Rome did not care. They had grown accustomed to the corruption of the system. They accepted a pope steeped in vice so long as he could deliver order and prosperity. And Alexander VI, with his political talent and decisiveness, knew how to win their trust, at least in those first years. Looking back, the conclave of 1492 was not merely an election. It was proof that the Vatican had become a stage where earthly power overshadowed everything. A stage where Rodrigo Borgia, armed with ambition and gold, seized the leading role, one that would place him in history not as a saint, but as a symbol of corruption. And from this moment, the true story begins. For the papal throne would bring not only glory, but also open the door to family intrigues, to feasts that grew ever more decadent, and to a chain of scandals that would drown Rome in an infamy like none before. When Rodrigo Borgia donned the papal robes and became Alexander VI, the throne was not his alone. In truth, that throne became the springboard for the entire Borgia family to rise. For Alexander, the highest office was not merely a sacred mission. It was an opportunity to elevate his children, to consolidate his power, to build a dynasty of his own within the very heart of the church. Among the children he had with Venosa Catanei, 3 names always stood out: Juan, Cesare, and Lucrezia. Each of them was destined to play a role in the bloody game their father was orchestrating. Juan Borgia, the eldest son, was the one Alexander cherished most. He granted Juan the title Duke of Gandia, married him into the royal family of Spain, and made him a noble, both wealthy and prestigious. But instead of becoming a model leader, Juan lived recklessly. Stories of his cruelty, his indulgence in pleasure, and his incompetence in war spread quickly through Rome. In the eyes of their enemies, Juan was the Achilles heel of the Borgia clan. Cesare Borgia, by contrast, was altogether different. From youth, Cesare revealed sharp intelligence, cold resolve, and an ambition as fierce as his father's. At just 18, he was made Archbishop of Valencia, then elevated to cardinal. Yet to Cesare, the scarlet robes of the church were only a disguise. His heart belonged not to the altar, but to the battlefield and to politics. In Cesare's piercing gaze, Rome was not simply the holy city, it was a prize to be conquered. Lucrezia Borgia, the only daughter, was a softer piece on the board, but no less important. Her beauty and grace drew the attention of courts across Europe. For Alexander, Lucrezia was a living bridge of diplomacy. Every marriage she entered was a treaty, a political arrangement. Her personal happiness was cast aside. In her father's hands, Lucrezia was never an innocent woman, but a carefully played strategic card. But the Borgia family was not only power, they were tragedy. And that tragedy erupted on a June night in 1497. That night, Juan disappeared after a banquet. Days later, his body was pulled from the Tiber River. His throat was slit, his body marked with 9 fatal wounds. All of Rome was shaken. Who had murdered the Pope's son? Rumors spread swiftly. Some whispered it was the work of political enemies. Others claimed it had been arranged from within the family itself, even by Cesare. For not long after, Cesare cast aside his cardinal's robes to become a secular warrior. Juan's death opened the path for Cesare to assume his new role. Freed from the church, he became the sword of the family. Alexander VI was devastated. It was said that for 3 days he neither ate nor slept, weeping like a grieving father, rather than a powerful pope. In his sorrow, he announced reforms, banning corruption, curbing excess, enforcing stricter discipline among the clergy. For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though tragedy had awakened him. But Rome was used to swift changes, and indeed, within months, every promise of reform was forgotten. The grief of losing Juan faded, and the ambition of the family returned. Alexander placed all his hopes in Cesare. If Juan had been his heart, Cesare was his sword, a blade cold, ruthless, yet effective. Meanwhile, Lucrezia was swept into one marriage after another. From Giovanni Sforza to Alfonso of Aragon, each union shattered under the weight of politics. One marriage was annulled under the absurd claim of impotence. Another ended in blood when her husband was murdered in his own bedchamber, with many sources suggesting it was Cesare who gave the order. Lucrezia became a figure of controversy. Was she a tragic victim or a willing accomplice in the family's ruthless schemes? The Borgias resembled a Greek tragedy. They possessed everything: power, wealth, beauty. But those very gifts became the seeds of their downfall. Love was turned into a weapon, marriage into a treaty, and death itself into a stepping stone for the living. Upon the papal throne, Alexander VI was at once a father, a pope, and a political schemer. Yet in every decision, he did not act as the head of the church, but as the head of a family. And so, whatever good his reign might have brought, was overshadowed by the tragedies of his own bloodline. From Juan's mysterious death, to Cesare's bloody rise, to Lucrezia's ill-fated marriages, all of it formed a spiral of power and tragedy. A spiral that would pull not only the Vatican, but all of Europe into years of turmoil. After the shadowy death of Juan Borgia, the weight of the family's destiny fell upon the second son, Cesare. From the very beginning, Alexander VI had laid out for him the path of the Church. At only 18, Cesare had been named Archbishop of Valencia, and soon after, elevated to cardinal. It was an honor that any clergyman might have envied. Yet for Cesare, it was nothing more than an ill-fitting cloak. Cesare was never truly a man of the Church. In his eyes, Rome was not a holy city to be defended with prayer, but a vast chessboard to be conquered with sword and cunning. He carried the beauty of youth, tall, handsome, magnetic in presence. But behind it lay a frozen soul, a calculating mind, and a hunger for power without limits. In 1498, Cesare became the first in history to voluntarily cast aside the red hat of a cardinal, a decision that shocked the entire church. But for Cesare, it was a necessary transformation. He wanted no shackles of law or scripture. He wanted to conquer the world with strength, not with prayer. And his father, Pope Alexander VI, fully supported him. At that very time, France was seeking the Vatican's blessing to legitimize King Louis XII's new marriage. Alexander seized the opportunity, marrying Cesare into French royalty and positioning him as a central piece in the Italian political game. The alliance with France gave Cesare military backing. From a cardinal bound by the Church, he quickly transformed into a warlord, a conqueror. With his military skill and ruthless nature, Cesare launched campaigns that his contemporaries both feared and admired. He used force to subdue the small city-states of central Italy, especially the Romagna region. One city fell, while another trembled and surrendered. Traitors were dealt with in terrifying ways, hanged in public, or quietly eliminated in the dead of night. Cesare ruled with a calculated blend of fear and admiration. But Cesare was not only a warrior. He was also a strategist. Each time he captured a city, he immediately rebuilt its administration, appointed officials, and ensured laws were enforced. He understood that power could not survive by the sword alone. It needed a functioning system, a new order. For this reason, many historians would later call Cesare not merely a tyrant, but a political architect. To Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat and philosopher, Cesare was the very model of the ideal prince. Machiavelli had followed him on campaigns, witnessing firsthand his coldness, his efficiency, and his skill in handling both enemies and allies. Later in The Prince, Machiavelli wrote that if there was one man worthy of being held up as an example for all rulers, it was Cesare Borgia. Under Cesare's hand, the Borgia family seemed to reach the peak of its power. Alexander VI acted as both father and pope, providing financial resources and sacred legitimacy. Cesare was the sword and the mind, turning that power into reality on the battlefield. Lucrezia, in her own role, remained a piece on the diplomatic chessboard, through her marriages. Together, they formed a triangle of power, with Cesare as the sharpest, most dangerous point. But such power required constant nourishment. To fund Cesare's campaigns, Alexander VI and his son did not hesitate to turn the Vatican into a bank of power. Church offices were openly sold. The cardinal's hat was no longer a symbol of faith, but a commodity for exchange. The money flowed directly into Cesare's military ventures. All of Europe was shaken, yet no one was strong enough to stand in their way. Cesare Borgia was living proof of the fusion between two worlds, the sacred and the worldly. He came from the church, yet became one of the most notorious warlords. He was cloaked in the holy authority of his father, yet acted like a true Italian prince. And it was this very combination that made him, in the eyes of admirers, a figure of greatness, and in the eyes of his enemies, a bloodthirsty tyrant. Cesare's height of power was not only a brilliant chapter in the chronicles of the Borgia family, but also a reminder of the price of ambition. For power may rise to its peak in the blink of an eye, but it can fall into ruin even faster. The story of Cesare's decline is the harshest proof of this truth. But before we reach that downfall, we must pause at his moment of glory, when all of Europe looked upon Cesare with awe, as though he embodied the ideal prince, cold, composed, and seemingly invincible. Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, was one of the most controversial women of the Renaissance. To many contemporaries, she was the very image of allure and mystery. Her beauty was praised across Europe: golden hair, pale, smooth skin, eyes as clear as a lake. Yet behind that delicate appearance lay a question with no certain answer. Was Lucrezia a victim, used and manipulated by her father and brother? Or was she herself a willing link in the ruthless machinery of Borgia power? From her earliest youth, Lucrezia's life was not her own. To Alexander VI, a daughter was not to be sheltered within palace walls, but to be played as a piece on the political chessboard. Every marriage she entered carried a strategic purpose. Her first marriage, to Giovanni Sforza, was a calculated alliance with the powerful Sforza family of northern Italy. But within only a few years, when that alliance no longer served its use, the marriage was annulled under the humiliating claim that Giovanni was impotent. All of Europe laughed, while Lucrezia bore the shame in public silence. Not long after, she was married to Alfonso of Aragon, a prince of Naples. At first, it seemed a hopeful match. Alfonso was handsome and appeared to truly love Lucrezia. But shifting political alliances soon turned her husband into an obstacle. When the alliance with Naples no longer served its purpose, Alfonso was brutally assassinated. Many sources suggest that Cesare gave the order, while Alexander turned a blind eye. Once again, Lucrezia was left a widow in the bloody game played by her father and brother. Yet Lucrezia was not always merely a victim. History and rumor alike have painted her with contradictions. Some saw her as the Borgia witch, a conspirator in poisonings and secret plots. There were whispers that she owned a hollow ring capable of concealing poison. A simple twist, and a rival at the banquet could be slain. Whether true or not, such stories turned Lucrezia into a symbol of danger and decadence in the eyes of the world. But look deeper, and a far more complex picture emerges. Lucrezia was raised in a family where every decision revolved around power. She was never allowed to choose love, nor to live for herself. All she could do was adapt, learning to smile at diplomatic banquets, learning to remain composed in the face of private heartbreak. In the letters that survive, we glimpse a sensitive soul, a woman who longed to be loved sincerely. In time, when she was married to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, Lucrezia finally found a measure of peace. In Ferrara, she became a model duchess, a patron of the arts, a devoted mother, and a woman who, at last, could step somewhat out of the heavy shadow of her father and brother. Many modern historians now believe that the image of a depraved Lucrezia was shaped more by the propaganda of political enemies than by truth itself. So in the end, who was Lucrezia Borgia? An unfortunate woman swept into the whirlpool of her family's power, a silent accomplice, willing to use her beauty as a weapon. Perhaps she was both, victim and survivor, learning how to endure in a world of blood and intrigue. For in the Borgia dynasty, no one could ever be completely innocent, and no one truly had the power to choose their own fate. Lucrezia's story, with all its light and shadow, became an inseparable part of the Borgia tragedy. She lives on in history as an enigma, remembered either as a beautiful and dangerous woman, or perhaps only as a lost soul longing for love, trapped in a family that treated affection as a tool of politics. During the reign of Alexander VI, the Vatican was no longer the sacred center of Christianity, as many once imagined. It gradually became a worldly palace, where lavish feasts and indulgent pleasures replaced hours of prayer and contemplation. The papal residence, once a symbol of purity, now wore the face of a secular court, no different from the palaces of Florence, Milan, or Naples. Each evening, the great halls of the Vatican glowed with candlelight. Tables overflowed with luxury, game from the forests, fish from the Mediterranean, fine wines from France and Spain. Music filled the air, dancers spun, actors sang, turning the papal palace into a theater of pleasure. The cardinals, who should have been models of humility, joined the revelry like worldly nobles, raising their cups and conversing with courtesans brought in to entertain. Julia Farnese, Alexander VI's famous mistress, was known by the nickname Julia la Bella, Julia the Beautiful. She walked the Vatican's corridors with the confidence of a queen. Her public presence and the devotion Alexander lavished upon her were undeniable proof that the line between private passion and sacred duty had been erased. Under Alexander's reign, the Vatican was no longer a holy sanctuary, but a stage upon which he displayed both his power and his desires. But these banquets were not only for pleasure, they were instruments of politics. By hosting lavish feasts, Alexander created opportunities to draw in allies, to buy support, to secure loyalty. Those who sat at his table, sharing food, wine, and indulgence, found it difficult to later rise up against the Pope. And those who refused to attend often found themselves turned into enemies. Where did the money for such extravagance come from? The answer lay within the very system of the Church itself. Alexander VI transformed the Vatican into a vast black market of souls. Church offices were openly sold. The wealthy could buy a cardinal's hat for their sons, purchase bishoprics, or secure indulgences. Every position in the church became a commodity, exchanged for gold. Gold that flowed directly into the treasury to fund both the feasts and Caesare's military campaigns. This policy not only provoked outrage among faithful clergy, but also planted the seeds of the great reform movement to come. Rome in those years became a city with two faces. By day, processions of pilgrims still knelt in churches, praying for salvation. But by night, in the Vatican's grand halls, laughter, music, and the clinking of cups echoed like the court of a secular kingdom rather than the heart of Christendom. This contrast left outside observers both astonished and enraged. In the eyes of the world, the reign of Alexander VI was the very proof of the Church's corruption. The Vatican, once a symbol of sacrifice and faith, now resembled a vast stage where power, beauty, music, and desire merged into a single extravagant performance. But this was not a play of faith. It was a play for power, for ambition, for the glory of the Borgia family. On the night of October 31st, 1501, Halloween, when tradition says the boundary between the sacred and the profane, between the living and the dead, grows thinnest, within the glittering halls of the Vatican, the Borgia family hosted a feast that history would whisper about in horror for centuries to come, the Banquet of Chestnuts. The setting was prepared with care. The grand hall of Cesare Borgia's residence was adorned with magnificent frescoes depicting scenes of Greek mythology and Christian history. Candlelight flickered against the painted walls, casting shadows that made the atmosphere at once opulent and unsettling. The banquet table overflowed with delicacies, fine wines poured without end, yet all of that was only the prelude. For the true centerpiece of the evening was not food, but the human body. The guests were among the most powerful in Rome: cardinals, nobles, foreign ambassadors, all pressed shoulder to shoulder. But the true stars of the night were 50 courtesans, hand-picked by Cesare himself. They were not the common women of the streets, but the most beautiful, the most skilled, chosen to take part in a spectacle unlike anything seen before. The evening began as any other feast: eating, drinking, conversation, music. But when the plates were cleared away, the atmosphere changed. Under the wavering glow of candles, the courtesans began to dance, at first in their elegant gowns, then letting each layer fall to the floor until their bodies were bare. The music quickened. Laughter grew louder. Wine filled the cups, and restraint disappeared. Then came the chestnuts, the detail that gave the infamous banquet its name. Chestnuts were scattered across the floor, glimmering in the candlelight placed low upon the ground. The naked courtesans were made to crawl on hands and knees to collect them, while the guests cheered, laughed, and indulged their eyes in the scene of raw debauchery. The Vatican, which should have been filled with prayer and sacred rites, became instead a theater of flesh. According to the diary of Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, Pope Alexander VI himself was present, alongside Cesare and even Lucrezia Borgia. The image of Lucrezia seated there has troubled historians for centuries. Was she truly complicit, or merely forced into presence as another pawn of her family? The answer remains uncertain, but the very sight of a daughter seated between father and brother in the midst of such utter depravity was enough to make history itself shudder. The climax of the banquet was its final contest. The gentlemen competed to see who could lie with the greatest number of courtesans. The winners were awarded prizes, silk garments, leather shoes, jeweled ornaments. It was a public competition of lust, held under the very eyes of the Pope, turning the Vatican into an arena of debauchery. The horror lay not only in the acts themselves, but in their openness. This was not a secret revel in some hidden chamber. It was an event attended by the elite, men who held both political and religious power. In this way, Alexander VI turned a depravity into a political weapon. Those who took part became bound by their own guilt, making it far harder for them to betray him or to speak against him. The next morning, Rome carried on as usual. Church bells rang, Mass was held, pilgrims knelt in prayer. But beneath the surface, whispers of the Banquet of Chestnuts spread quickly. The tale passed beyond the Vatican's walls, into the ears of foreign envoys, and soon across all of Europe. Kings, courts, even rivals long accustomed to corruption, shuddered at the thought of what had taken place in the very heart of the church. Burchard recorded every detail in his diary with a dry, precise tone, like an administrative report. And it was this coldness of description that made the account even more haunting. Centuries later, when the Vatican opened its archives, scholars still trembled as they touched those pages. For they were not only the record of a night of debauchery, but the evidence of an entire papacy's decay. The Banquet of Chestnuts became the enduring symbol of the Church's corruption during the Renaissance. It was the perfect piece of a darker portrait of Alexander VI as a pope who turned the Vatican into a stage, power into a game, people into pawns, and desire into a way of life. The consequences of that night were more than scandal. They planted the seeds of reform. Thinkers, men like Martin Luther, looked upon stories from the Vatican and found in them the arguments to challenge papal power. And among those stories, none was more powerful, more undeniable, than the tale of the Banquet of Chestnuts. On that Halloween night of 1501, the chestnuts scattered across the stone floors of the Vatican became a symbol of the collapse of the boundary between the sacred and the profane, a symbol of corruption when power was left unchecked, and a symbol of the infamous legacy Alexander VI would leave behind, one that would stain the history of the Church for centuries to come. After the night of October 31st, 1501, Rome awoke as if nothing had happened. Church bells still rang, Mass was still celebrated, pilgrims still knelt before the altar of St. Peter. But in the narrow alleys, in the crowded markets, and in the corridors of foreign embassies, whispers of the Banquet of Chestnuts had already begun to spread. And once the tale escaped the Vatican walls, it could no longer be contained. From the lips of guards to the ears of servants, from servants to merchants, and swiftly to the desks of diplomats, the story traveled. Foreign envoys, some invited to attend or informed by witnesses, quickly recorded every detail in the reports they sent back to their courts. Those letters, still preserved today in archives across Europe, reflect the shock of men who were themselves no strangers to corruption. If even they were horrified, then the event had gone far beyond the standards of its age. Soon, the royal courts of France, Spain, Germany, and England all heard of that night of debauchery. The Vatican, once revered as the symbol of faith, became instead the subject of ridicule and contempt. Secular rulers, who had so often been lectured by the Pope on morality, now whispered among themselves, who, after all, was truly in need of moral instruction. It was not only kings who seized upon the story. Intellectuals, clergy, and reformers took it as a weapon. In Florence, the disciples of Savonarola, the fiery preacher burned at the stake for daring to denounce the Vatican, saw in it final proof that the Church had rotted to its core. In Germany, theologians began to ask, could a pope who lived in such depravity still claim the authority to call himself the representative of God on earth? Pressure spread across Europe. Many voices called for a council to depose Alexander VI, but his political power and the fear Caesare inspired kept anyone from acting decisively. Instead of repenting, Alexander grew even more defiant. He continued to host feasts, continued selling offices within the church to fund his son's ambitions of conquest. For Alexander, the public nature of scandal was almost liberating. Since all the world already knew of his debauchery, there was no longer any need to pretend to virtue. Yet within the hearts of the people, a fracture had formed. Pilgrims still came to Rome, for their faith in God was not easily shaken. But deep down, they began to separate their devotion to Christ from their disappointment in those who claimed to rule in his name. The Vatican was no longer untouchable. It had become a palace of whispers, of forbidden tales, a place where the sacred was mingled with laughter of the profane. The scandal, then, did not end with a single banquet. It became a symbol, a flame that lit the simmering anger across Europe. And that flame, only decades later, would ignite into the fire of the Reformation, shaking the very foundations of the Catholic Church. By 1503, the reign of Alexander VI was nearing its end. After more than a decade on the papal throne, the Borgia Pope remained powerful, but was worn down by scandal, conspiracy, and blood. Inside the Vatican Palace, he continued plotting to secure Caesare's position, even as Europe grew ever more hostile to the Borgia name. Then, that summer, death struck suddenly, taking not only Alexander's life, but dragging his entire dynasty toward collapse. In August of 1503, Alexander VI and Cesare attended a lavish banquet at the home of a cardinal. After the feast, both fell violently ill. A raging fever overtook them, leaving them delirious. Whispers spread that father and son had planned to poison a rival, but had instead drunk from the wrong cup, consuming the poison themselves. Others insisted it was nothing more than malaria, the familiar plague of the marshes around Rome. But whatever the cause, Alexander never recovered. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI drew his final breath. The news spread quickly, and Rome erupted, not with mourning, but with celebration. The people, long resentful of the Borgia rule, saw his death as a deliverance. Chroniclers wrote that his body swelled grotesquely, darkened, and reeked within only hours, so much so that those preparing him for burial were forced to fling open the windows, unable to bear the stench. To many, the sight seemed nothing less than a sign of God's judgment. Cesare, though alive, was gravely ill. As he struggled to recover, most of his power slipped away. Allies abandoned him. The territories he had conquered rose in revolt. Without his father's support, Cesare was reduced to a weary warlord, hunted by enemies on all sides. At last he died far from glory, cut down as an anonymous mercenary on a battlefield in Spain, ending forever the dream of a great Borgia dynasty. Lucrezia, the daughter once played as a political pawn, finally escaped the vortex of family ambition. Married to Alfonso d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, she became a respected duchess, a patron of the arts, and helped transform the Ferrara court into one of Italy's cultural centers. Yet even in peace, she could never escape her past. In the eyes of the world, her name remained forever entwined with the scandals of the Borgia family. The death of Alexander VI left a particular scar upon the Vatican. His successor, Pope Julius II, refused to live in Alexander's chambers, calling them defiled. He ordered them torn down, rebuilt, and had Raphael summoned to paint new frescoes. It took years for the Vatican to cover over the memory of the Borgia reign, as though trying to bury a stain that could never truly be erased. Looking back, the fall of the Borgias came with astonishing speed. In just a few years, they went from holding the papal throne and commanding mighty armies to losing everything. Alexander, dead. Cesare, overthrown. Lucrezia, exiled into the quieter role of a duchess, far from Rome. All that remained were the whispers, the darkened pages of history, and a legacy that left the church burdened with shame. For centuries to come, the death of Alexander VI did not simply close the life of one man. It marked the end of an entire dynasty. It was the death knell for a dream of unchecked power, and the bitter reminder of a truth. Power gained through gold and desire can never endure. The passing of Alexander VI closed one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Vatican. Yet the shadow of the Borgia reign did not end there. It spread, seeped deep, and left scars across the memory of Europe. Looking back, one sees not only a corrupt pope, but the downfall of a system that had allowed him to thrive. And it was precisely this legacy that opened the path to one of the greatest religious upheavals in human history. In Rome, the first consequence was the loss of credibility. The Borgia papacy stripped the church of its sacred aura. The people, once seeing the pope as the embodiment of holiness, now began to separate their faith in God from their disappointment in those who claimed his name. When Alexander died, the crowds did not mourn. They rejoiced. That fact alone spoke volumes. The Vatican was no longer untouchable. It had become a place where even common citizens dared to criticize, even to mock. Across Europe, the Borgia era became a weapon in the hands of reformers. Martin Luther, in launching the Reformation of the early 16th century, often pointed to the rot within the Vatican as proof to challenge papal authority. Tales of the Banquet of Chestnuts, of the sale of offices and indulgences, became vivid evidence that the Church had strayed far from its founding ideals. Resistance that had long smoldered now caught flame, and the flame grew into a storm that tore through Europe, dividing Christianity into Catholic and Protestant. Within the Church itself, the Borgia legacy left a profound mark. Successive popes were forced to undertake strict reforms to restore credibility. The Council of Trent, which began in 1545, laid down rigorous rules for clerical discipline, for purity in ritual, and for ensuring that no pope could ever again live so openly in luxury and vice. In many ways, these reforms were born as a direct reaction to the stain left behind by Alexander VI. But the legacy of the Borgias was not only one of shame. It also left behind lessons in history. First, it showed that absolute power, when unchecked, can so easily turn a human being into a monster. Rodrigo Borgia did not begin his career as a man of corruption. Yet when he sat upon the highest throne, he believed himself above the law. And that was the root of every tragedy. That lesson transcends time and remains true for every system of power that came after. Second, their legacy revealed the fragile link between faith and institution. The people continued to believe in God, yet their trust in the Church as an institution could collapse because of the failings of a few individuals. When Alexander VI turned the Vatican into a stage of indulgence, he did not only destroy himself, he shook the foundations of a religious order that had stood for centuries. And finally, the Borgia story reminds us that history is never simple. Alexander VI was not only a man of vice, he was also a shrewd politician, a father devoted to his children, a man who seized every opportunity to strengthen his dynasty. Lucrezia was not only the Borgia witch of rumor, but also a woman longing for true love. Cesare was not only bloodthirsty, but also the inspiration for Machiavelli's The Prince. It is this very complexity that makes the Borgia legacy both despised and fascinating, impossible for posterity to forget. Today, when visitors walk through the radiant halls of the Vatican, gazing at Raphael's frescoes, few remember that these same walls once echoed with the laughter of the Banquet of Chestnuts. But beneath the layers of splendor, history still whispers. It reminds us that even the greatest institutions can decay from within, and that sometimes a single night of indulgence can alter the course of an entire civilization. The legacy of Alexander VI, then, is not only a stain, it is a mirror, a warning to every generation that power without limits and faith without discipline can turn the sacred into the profane and the throne of saints into the seat of demons.